皆さんこんにちは。タッチベースの野村です。今回のテーマは英語の慣用句イディオムに関する内容です。イディオムを使用する前に押さえるべき3つのイディオムタイプということで、おなじみのスペンサーとのインタビューの様子を流していきたいと思います。イディオムの中には世界で共通して使われているものだけではなくて、地域ごとのイディオム、世代ごとのイディオム、スポーツ由来のイディオムなど様々なイディオムの種類が存在します。レコーディングではその解説プラス実例、さらに実際のイディオムを使用する際の注意点もご紹介しています。またタッチベースの記事にて実際に使えるイディオム表現105選もまとめておりますので、そちらも合わせてチェックしてください。これまでと同じく音声は英語です。日本語のスクリプトを見たい方はタッチベースの記事をチェックしてください。それでは本編どうぞ。
I'll be talking a little bit about idioms and some common areas where people have trouble with them. So the definition of an idiom, according to dictionary.com, is a group of words established by usage as having a meaning not deducible from those of the individual words, which is confusing definition in and of itself. So I would recommend English learners stay away from idioms until they reach a very advanced level. As stated in the definition, the meaning cannot be construed through an analysis of their words, so they're very hard to remember. Also, they are not very common in everyday society. You might work for months in an American office and still not hear a popular idiom you might have learned in a textbook. Other idioms you might learn you might never hear at all. Finally, idioms are often spoken and rarely written. They are only said in specialized situations, and they're not considered appropriate for formal writing in reports. Besides this, there's also a few other reasons why you should be careful when studying idioms. One of the reasons is that idioms can be regional. So that means that some idioms only appear in certain places. For example, in the Boston area, you may hear someone say bang a Yui when telling someone to turn around on the highway. The root of this and the meaning of this is to make a U-turn. So to go from one lane going forward to turning and going into the opposite lane to turn around. Bang is funny. In this case, you may think bang is a loud sound, but in this case, it's a slang term meaning to do a work task quickly or efficiently and with a level of expertise that doesn't require much thought. For an example with bang, I banged out the report in under 3 hours, or I banged out a few emails before I left. So going back to the original idiom, the proper usage or the proper image for bang a Yui would be to make a U-turn as quickly and safely as possible. More likely than not, the speaker is telling you that you're going in the wrong direction. So there's a lot of learning packed into that. You have to know a lot of things, which can be wasteful because, bang a Yui is only used in the New England area. People will look at you funny if you use this idiom in other parts of the country.
Yeah, I think a lot of people even Japanese people are aware of a risk of using idioms. But at the same time, it kind of creates, sort of bond.
I think I know what you're getting at. Are you familiar with the term inside joke? And it's cool because you're reinforcing the bond that you have with your friend, right? So an idiom is kind of the same thing, except it's like the whole country. So when you say an idiom, you're saying something that, as stated in the definition, doesn't make grammatical sense. You're required to have deep cultural knowledge to understand the meaning of this. In that sense, in the sense that you're talking about it, understanding an idiom and using an idiom correctly can make you feel part of the team. I was at a dinner for the consul general in Boston, and he gave a speech, and he talked all about, and this is the consul general of the Boston area, and he talked all about idioms specific to Boston, like running a packy, for example, means going to the liquor store to get beer. Well, the funniest thing is here's the consul general in his suit and tie. He's in front of a crowd of very like Harvard scholars, business leaders, things like that. And he's talking about running a Paggy. He successfully navigated, difficult idioms, which is, I think, a good strategy. Just make it funny.
But you're saying that it's kind of an advanced level.
They can misunderstand you, but worse, maybe even they can see you as someone who doesn't quite have the level of ability that they say they do. A good way to sort of get around this is to just recognize the fact. If there's an idiom that you learned, but you're not sure of how to use it, just talk about it and be like, hey, so I read this weird thing online. It said bang a Yui when you turn around. Like, do we say that here? Another tricky thing in a place that you can mismatch is idioms. Well, as I said before, they're rarely written down. So they're usually very generation oriented. Millennial generation might use idioms that, Generation X doesn't use, or the baby boomers. Everyone has their different words because they all have sort of shared events. Well, a good example of that is, in my parents' generation, in the 1970s and 60s, there's a very common expression when you're interested in something. You say, "Hey, you dig?" It means like sort of, "Do you like this?" or "Do you want to be interested in this?" And I've heard people, my parents' generation, say this all the time. Hey, can you dig it? Do you dig? But for me, it's a little kind of uncool to say that, especially because it comes from another generation of people using it, and none of my friends or anyone in my social circle uses "can you dig it" seriously. But again, you'll hear it all the time, especially like if you watch a movie that's set in the 1970s, you might hear this idiom a lot, but that's not a reason to use it. So you need to make sure that an idiom is still being used today. Moving on, I guess, is another place where idioms come from. A lot of idioms come from is sports. If you do want to learn idioms, sports might be the best place to start. Baseball, football, basketball are all very popular in the United States. For example, you may hear, and this will come up in business conversation as regularly, is the idiom Hail Mary, or I'm going to throw a Hail Mary or do a Hail Mary. Now, Hail Mary originally is a religious practice. It's a Christian prayer that you say at your bed. But in football, in the last few seconds of the football game, a team that is losing will make a desperate play by trying to throw the ball all the way down the field in one go, in one pass to score victory. It's a desperate measure and it requires a lot of luck, but it can work spectacularly, and it has worked spectacularly over the time, a few times over the years. So in business, you might hear it used in a similar way. So when all other ways to do something have been exhausted, you might use the idiom Hail Mary when you want to try something desperate. For example, I did a Hail Mary and sent them the proposal even though it was still incomplete. So there's a high chance of failure, but you tried anyway, because who knows, they might accept it. In that same vein, is another idiom called last ditch. That is another idiom that means this is the last thing we're trying. Another idiom comes from baseball, and that idiom is out in left field. So you may know the left field of baseball in a baseball game sees little action, so it doesn't get much attention. And when something does happen there, it's often surprising. So this idiom means an unexpected idea or an unexpected thing that someone says, and it often has a negative connotation. So, for example, we were talking about focusing on the San Francisco area, but our boss suddenly said he wants to launch in Texas. It was totally out in left field. So you can see most of the concentration, the focus was on San Francisco, and then there's a random suggestion. And we use out in left field to describe something like that. Sports idioms are great, but you have to know the sport, I would say. It helps a lot to know the referential point.
I think asking your friend, like who is a native English speaker, is one way, one way to confirm which one of the idioms is used versus no longer used. Is there any other way that you can verify idioms that are used versus are not used anymore?
If you watch a current show, you can listen to the types of words they use. Again, just make sure that the show is set in contemporary, modern America. But you also have to be careful because shows like that sometimes intentionally make up new words or new idioms in order to be like a unique show.